Hello, my name is Dr. Kasee Stratton. I'm an associate professor at Mississippi State University in the United States, as well as the director of the T.K. Martin Center for Technology and Disability at Mississippi State University. I have been a part of the CHARGE community for about 15 years, researching this genetic condition and being involved in clinical work with the population of individuals with CHARGE. That has included very young individuals as well as individuals as they have aged and taken on the adult role in their life and being a part of that environment as well. I'm pleased to join you today to talk about pain and stress and what kind of impact that might have on challenging behaviors for individuals with CHARGE and why it's so valuable to identify pain in this population.